Okay, great. I want to thank you, the organizer, I'm so happy to be part of this conference. And I'm going to today talk about youth and labor landscape from Turkish context and how young people, particularly young graduates, navigating precarious labor landscape in the Turkish context. And this presentation is part of my PhD dissertation, so any comments really appreciated. And a bit context why I'm looking at Turkey, because Turkey is an interesting case. We can put somewhere between the global north and the global south, the west and the east, that are the geographical imaginaries in terms of organization of work and life and the political organization. So, and another thing, that Turkey is transforming an authoritarian neoliberalism, adopting conservative gender regime, makes Turkey is a very interesting case. Looking at roles of work outside the West, outside the global North context. So looking at the Turkish context, I think opens up very important question, looking at the roles of work. And I argue that simply over the last decade, Turkey is transforming authoritarian neoliberalism and adopting a conservative gender regime produces space of waiting for working population and for young people. And this neoliberalization process dates back to 1980s, but the current ruling party, Justice and Development Party, consolidated neoliberalization process when they came power in 2001. And the ruling party introduces extensive labor policies aiming flexibilization, informalization, wage suppression, dismantling unionized working population, and it creates a labor landscape, the working population stuck in a vicious cycle of indebtedness, unemployment, and precarious employment. It creates a fragmented working population, and it's proletarization and precarization and fragmentation, three important labor discipline mechanism in Turkish labor landscape. And of course, the pandemic mandated economic crisis, making life and work more precarious for the working population, and particularly for young people. And we right now experiencing high risk unemployment rate, youth unemployment rate 25% September in 2020, and roughly 28% of the young graduate out of work, and unemployment rate among young graduates increased 5 times over the 15 years. And during the pandemic, young people gave up seeking job, raised by 135%, and most of them, as you predicted, young women, and they are young women holding a university degree living in urban centers. And of course, we cannot separate the changing in the labor landscape from the changes in the political spaces, political landscapes, and especially to suppress the rising unrest among the working population, the ruling government introduces and adopted authoritarianism to suppress the social unrest and the class conflicts. And over the last decade, we are experiencing state overtly negligence in feminicide, violence at rate against LGBTQ people, and using authoritarianism. And there are so many examples I can talk about: social media surveillance, arbitrarily detained human rights. There are some examples we can see rising authoritarianism in Turkish context. But of course, in addition to authoritarianism, the ruling government adopting conservative gender regime to regulate the domestic spaces. And especially the President Erdogan and the ruling government repeatedly reminding women's role, caretakers, mothers, problem solvers in the times of the crisis. There are so many examples I want to share with you, but I took the 3 statements by the president. The first one, there is a new trend among youth. President Erdogan said, the marriage age of youth is above 30, that is unacceptable, he said recently. Another one, he said, a woman who refuses maternity, gives up housekeeping, actually denying her femininity. She is lucky she is a half person. And President Erdogan called birth control as a treason. Actually, this kind of messages creates a very complicated message for young women graduates, because neoliberal governing technologies encourage young people to invest themselves, to get education, to get a job, to formal wage work. But at the same time, the government expected women as caretaker. So these conflicting messages, what kind of waiting experience produces for young people? This is kind of the question I'm trying to respond in this presentation. Conceptual framework, I'm not going to talk about it because we don't have so much time. And precarity at work, precarious of life, I think you are familiar with those debates and discussion. My position in this literature, my position, I'm trying to synthesize precarity at work, precarious of life. I think the separating work from life or vice versa, it's highly difficult considering how unemployment and the enlarging forms of precarious employment. So my position is synthesizes two approaches. And I'm also using the weighting as a concept. Weighted is first developed by the Diane Singerman in 2007. She developed this concept, tried to understand young people, young graduate unemployment experiences. And she said, weighted is a place, young people stuck in a liminal world, and it is not a temporary thing, it is becoming a permanent thing. And my fieldwork, basically, I conducted my fieldwork during the pandemic, and I conducted 62 in-depth interviews to young graduates living in the urban centers, and most of them young women. 50 of the 61 are young women. So, but I'm also making interview the young men, and most of them are out of work. They are or they are working in the precarious job. And the rest of the presentation, I'm bringing the testimonies collected from the fieldwork. And what I argue in this presentation, waiting spaces is also contested spaces. Why? Because the governance technology, authoritarianism, and precarious landscape produces waiting spaces. But at the same time, there's a potential for the young people. They are produce alternative subjectivities, and they are produce different ways to navigate the precarity. And for instance, Ida, she argues that there's a kind of the entanglements of the political and economic structure. She is 25 years old, and she said, we are a generation stuck in a limbo, vicious cycle. Frankly saying, as a young woman, I don't know I have a livable life, since I don't have time or money. Everyone in this country is stuck in waiting. The state suppressed oppositional voices, silencing us. The state is polarizing society by fueling hatred amongst people. Beyond finding a decent job, I cannot breathe. I'm just trying to survive. Work conditions are terrible. Everyone underestimates private security workers. We are kind of invisible to customers. When they see us, they treat us as slave. We are kind of their possessions. They treat you like you are inferior. When you expose to sexual harassment, nobody does anything to protect you. In a capitalist structure, if anybody holds power, they find a way to exploit you. And this is kind of basic rule of capitalism. Actually, I asked her work experiences, and she didn't separate what's going on in the politics and what's going on in the economic structure. And also waiting spaces is also a very contested space, because young people try to find their places somewhere between precarious employment or out of work. For instance, Ceren, she is 25 years old. She said she is unemployed and give up looking for a job. She said, the employer offered me less than minimum wage in a job interview. He also asked me if I plan to get married soon. I asked him why he was asking about my private life. He replied, I had to ask you since your future husband wouldn't want you to work. Then I realized they don't want to see working women in the labor market. I demanded a minimum wage and employment insurance. The employer pissed at me. This job demands 6 work days and 4 hours commuting time. So she said, I'm waiting at home, because waiting at home less costly than working. Actually, she brings a different conceptualization, the cost of work. In the waiting spaces, young people also calculate the cost of work and to compare to being unemployed or working in the precarious job. And another example, Sedat. Sedat, he is a 25 years old man and unemployed for more than a year. He said, there's a competition for having access to torpil. Torpil in Turkish, it means having strong ties with influential people. Right now in Turkish context, it refers to have strong ties with the ruling party. After 6 months job hunting, I gave up looking for a job. In job interviews, they are asking with whom you are affiliated. Who's your torpilist? If I knew somebody affiliated with the party, I'm sure I would be working now. I do not expect more than a minimum wage. I'm not picky, but it hurts me. Actually, he defines his unemployment as a physical pain. And he said, right now, I'm waiting now. When waiting, you cannot move and do anything. All of my friends are out of work, have given up looking for a job. The unemployment statistic numbers do not represent and reflect us. Another testimony I want to share with you, the waiting spaces becoming a contested spaces. At the same time, young people kind of to navigate trade-offs, produces refusal and responses. For instance, Dennis, she is 25 years old, and she said, everybody expects you to work in well-paid jobs since you are a university graduate. What is impossible right now? I ended up working 13 and 14 hours for 12 USD dollar as a day as a call center. So I quit the job. I waited for a while. I searched for the ways to make money outside the formal job market. Starting with rearing 50 chicken in a tiny coop, I entered the field that I have never been. I first began to sell chicken eggs in my neighborhood. I went to dozens of local grocery, met building, but other male co-workers, they call, I'm reliable and capable of doing this as a young woman. Besides, your family expects you to undertake more household chores than ever because you are home. Even though I'm still making money, my job is not seen as a normal job to them. When they are out of work, they are obviously enforced to stay at home, but reliance of economically and emotional the family, there's a trade-off. Especially for young women, the family expected young women undertake more unpaid work at home. There's a trade-off. And it's also creates some responses, refusals. For instance, Sema, she is a 25 years old woman, and she is also working. She gave up looking for a job in the formal job market. She said, considering my past work experiences, I prefer not working rather than being exposed to male gazes in the workplace. You're probably only women worker among the male worker on the construction site. Women are considered for clerical job, not in a construction site. During my internship, my supervisor warned me about my clothing, putting on more conservative clothes. No matter how much I pay attention to my dress and acting, nothing has changed. As a woman, your existence here is a problem for men. Everything you do is a woman problem. You're walking, you're working, you're smiling, you're everything. And she actually summarizes how just the state approach to women is also entangled, embedded in the work relations. And I'm going to talk about a bit responses, and I'm going to wrap up my presentation. Using, for instance, she actually using space of weighted as a producer responses. She's working, she said, I've been working since I was 12. I used all cleaning, sewing, ironing at the garment workshop or owner relatives. I always been in the informal job market. Work as a waitress, sales assistant, cleaner. I learned rules of work life and I met many people. But I feel exhausted now because I know there is no salary difference between informal job and formal job. But if I need a childcare benefit and unemployment payment in the future, I wouldn't be able to get it if I worked in an informal job. I put a lot of effort to get this degree. I had to persuade my dad, and she said, I'm back to, and she sent many resumes to companies, but she didn't get a reply. She said, I'm back to the job I used to do. You know, you have always to go in between, keep backup job. Actually, she using backing up a job is an individual strategy, but this is only not an individual strategy. It is also household strategy. For instance, Duygu, she is 26 years old, women, and she is working in a formal job, but at the same time, she is also navigating gray areas between informal and formal job market. She said, I'm oldest kid in family. I have to drop out school to work, then go back to school several times. I've been working for as long as I know myself. And now I'm working as a secretary with benefits and minimum wage, but I am also doing on-call job where I'm making money hourly. When I am not available for call, my little sister will substitute me. We are granting at this one job, keeping it with the household. And keeping it a backup job is not an individual strategy. It's also emerge and household strategy. At the conclusion, space of waiting are emerge as contested site where young people are stuck in a vicious cycle of indebtedness, unemployment, and precarious employment, and exposed to state-induced conservative gender regime. But I think these spaces are not kind of the young people, they are not passive subject. They are actively, dialectically reproduces alternative subjectivities, and responses as they navigate precarious landscape, to rebuilding networks, going in between gray areas in the job market, backup job, and these strategies actually challenging to attribution to the work. And it calls us, we have to go beyond considering the dualistic construction of the work and life. And so we need to delve into entanglements of the political and economic organization and everyday strategies people are improvising. And thank you. I hope just my time management, I'm terrible at, but I hope it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hilal. It was a very engaging presentation and the voices were so powerful, and I can't wait to, read more of your work. Thank you so much for this. The next presentation will be by Tatiane Reis. You can start, Tatiane. You can introduce yourself and go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Storti. Thank you, everybody. I would like to thank all the program planning members for organizing everything. I can imagine that it was a great amount of work that you put. And I'm very happy to have deliver my first presentation as a PhD student during the GLRC. And I am a first year. Let me just share my screen here. Just a moment, please. Okay, so I hope everybody can see it. Just a moment. I don't know why. Yeah, my computer is kind of not. All right, so it's here. So in fact, this title is a question, and it's not only for rhetorical purposes. It's just because I still don't have the answers since I started studying as a PhD student last month. I'm taking the course at DFWS, Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies. So basically, I will share my background in a way to explain why this question is like my essential driver, what's my essential driver to apply to the PhD program. And this is related to my ambitions, my principles, and things like that. So basically my background is in history. So both undergraduate and my master's degree are in history in Brazil. And I've studied gender for over 10 years, but I should say that it was, the courses were Eurocentric, and I had to, when I realized that my teaching experience required more Black scholars to discuss inequalities in an appropriate way, I had to I could count on NGOs and social movements, especially Black social movements in Brazil. So it was at that time that I could really understand and figure out how knowledge and change can really work together, not only inside the academia, but also outside the academia. African studies in Brazil, they have expanded a lot. There are new courses, new graduate courses, but still there are many challenges that we face there. And as far as I could see, that's a challenge that all Global South has still faces, and especially now because of budget cuts after the pandemic. Unfortunately, this situation might get worse. So especially during the 90s, development and gender, they were constantly referred to as connected. I'm not saying that this is bad, because there was an expansion. I think there are, according to what I read, over 800 degree programs focused on gender only in the USA. There are also gender institutes in Africa and in many continents. And this expansion was intensified during the 90s. But the problem is that many times the conception of development is Eurocentric. And then when we think about gender inequalities in the African countries, and if you project those standards in a way that African countries should pursue or emulate this development path in order to keep up with European countries, and then so many problems will remain. So that's why I'm saying beyond parity in numbers. So it's not only about increasing salaries, wealth, redressing social inequalities. Of course, those aspects are important, but there are some logics that they don't show as true. For example, it's not true that if the GDP growth maintains, necessarily gender inequalities will be reduced. There are many, for example, Rwanda, Namibia, they don't have GDP, massive GDPs, but their position in gender inequality is much better than many Latin countries, Brazil, for example. So that's why I'm saying that this kind of connection is not, they are not directly proportional, development and gender. Also, I'm based on a concept of development that is based on Amartya Sen's conception, which says that we need to pursue enhancing the lives and the freedoms. So development is not the end. It will be a kind of means for human beings be autonomous, be freedom. So there must be autonomy, and they can be really agents of that change. So that would be the idea. And why am I mentioning also race? Because if we think about the globalized world, exportation, which is something that many African countries rely on, we cannot disregard the international arenas and how regulations are elaborated, the kinds of trades that are at stake, and of course that the capitalist system is founded on racism. So racism is not just an element that is that could be isolated from the lives and from research. So that would be basically the idea. So trying to narrow a little bit, I know it's still a wide scope, but I'm talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, agriculture and informality. So the averages, since we are talking about a continent that has over 54 countries, the reality, if you see just the average, they kind of hide many aspects. So for example, in average, the average of rural population in Africa is 62.5%. It was in 2015. But there are countries that this proportion is kind of 80%. So 80% of the population would be living in rural areas, for example, Uganda, Malawi, Ethiopia. So the averages are not enough for us to understand all the differences and all the complex realities that exist in the African continent. Also, if we talk about social inequalities, poverty is a major issue. And rural poverty is a major, so for example, I don't have many statistical data here. I didn't want to just bring numbers, but rural poverty tends to be more severe. But by saying that, I'm not implying that industrializing or urban areas are necessarily the solution. The questions that I'm trying to raise here is, how rural populations are facing those challenges. What are their initiatives besides Eurocentric approaches that they have been constructing, and what are why many times we don't know about them, why they don't get so much support. So that would be the point. And Hilal Carol was talking about informal jobs. So informality is something really important when we are studying the global south, for example. And in this case here, I'm not talking only about informality, for example, as street sellers that are very common in Africa. I am also talking about informal jobs in formal settings. So there are some formal settings where you can also find informal workers. And also mutual support is really crucial to understand, especially Black communities, because there has this long tradition of mutual support and the ways that those networks fight against anti-Black racism. Oh, I think I have only 1 minute. Is that so, Shirti? I think it is.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
All right. So what kind of networks and leaderships are ongoing there? So first of all, there are many forums. For example, there is the Eastern and Southern Africa Small-Scale Farmers Forum, where cooperatives get together and they raise their voices against problems such as land ownership or genetic modified products and corporations and things like that. So European, or I'm saying European because the European Union is like a major donor, if we can say that, and invest in different initiatives. So that's why I'm giving you this example. So that's not the only development driver that there is. In fact, I am bringing the concept of Black social economy from Professor Caroline Shanaz Hossein, in which she says that there is this major Black scholarship that many times NGOs and also many agencies that work with development, they are likely to ignore this literature, and the informality cannot be seen only as an obstacle, a kind of challenge to overcome. No, many times informality is a strategy because Black people understand how the state was built, and they are many times how can I say, discriminated in government relations and government actions. So my early remarks would just cover the transnational networks. So I am willing to take a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach. So I am not, I don't intend to investigate how an international NGO supports female agriculture, female-led cooperatives. No, my idea is that I can take this bottom-up approach, how those women are dealing and tackling their social problems, economic problems, and how they interact and how they support each other in this scenario. So those are my references. I'm sorry if I didn't respect the time, and I will appreciate, since I am really in the beginning of my research, I will appreciate any comments and questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tatiane. And please don't apologize. We totally understand that you might go over, and you'll definitely get some very good feedback. So I'm so glad about that. And this is a very interesting topic. something that so many of us relate to. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have a final presentation from Alia Khan, York University, and you're talking about Islamophobia and exploration of gendered labor in the Twitter sphere. Thank you so much, Alia. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I just want to start by thanking the GLRC conference and all the organizers for inviting me, and also for such an engaged kind of set of presentations that came before me. Those were so brilliant. And my name obviously is Alia, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Social and Political Thought here at York. And my research interests are gendered Islamophobia and space. So today, I am going to be presenting on gendered Islamophobia and Twitter. Yes, Twitter. I spend all my time there, so I decided why enjoy a good thing without ruining it by analyzing it? And I'm going to be asking the following questions about Twitter. The first question is, how do Muslims on Twitter respond to incidents of Islamophobia? How do Muslims on Twitter respond to incidences of gendered Islamophobia? How do these responses differ? And significant to this conference, what are the implications of these different responses in terms of gender and emotional work? So, sorry, to summarize, I'm interested in comparing the responses of Muslim Twitter, #MuslimTwitter, related to Islamophobia versus gendered Islamophobia in terms of the gendered labor expectations, and my geographical context is North America, Canada, the US, and a little bit of the UK. It's worth mentioning every time I present on Islamophobia, gendered Islamophobia, that the point of this presentation is not to validate the Orientalist trope that Muslim women need to be saved by white men or by Western civilization, but just to problematize the gender-based dynamics that exist in many communities and to highlight the contradictions that arise when Muslim women engage with content online. So to answer the questions I raised earlier, I'm going to examine responses on Muslim Twitter to the incident on June 4th, 2021, where a Muslim family of 5 was attacked by a truck driver, leaving 4 of them deceased and 1 young boy injured and traumatized. I will then juxtapose these responses to the ways in which the same Muslim Twitter responded to an August 28th incident where a popular social media influencer and preacher or expert, Osama Issa, was outed by his ex-wife Shamian for grooming and sexual abuse. And following this, other Muslim women shared similar experiences with the perpetrator. And it's worth noting that the outing of Osama Issa took place in Columbus, Ohio, but many Muslim women, including myself, were involved with engaging with relevant content because, and I'm making a personal observation here, it was familiar. So we'll start with a few definitions. Critical race thinker Jasmine Zine came up with the term gendered Islamophobia, and it refers to the double banishment of Muslim women from society at large as racialized minorities, and then from their communities as gendered minorities. Emotional work refers to the management of self-feeling, the work of making others feel a certain way, and the effort involved in giving definition to one's work. This is gender and race scholar Kiran Miranchandani's definition. She's a UFT scholar. And finally, in terms of the type of labor at play, I will be talking about what Marxist sociologist Christian Fuchs refers to as prosumption. That is the simultaneous consumption and production of content online as a type of labor. So ultimately, just to reiterate the question, I'm interested in examining how Muslims on Twitter prosume content in response to stories of Islamophobic violence and violence against Muslim women. And so to answer this question, it's important to set the stage. In my work, I'm interested in the question of scale. By no means am I like a labor scholar. And I'm interested in how Muslim women experience violence online versus in community spaces versus in institutional spaces, and how these spaces are relational. It's therefore important to note that the online space has always been a space where people have maintained real relationships. Sociologist Valerie Francisco Menchavez points out that the transnational families use Facebook and Skype to remain connected and maintain intimacy in contexts where they're often separated for long periods of time. When thinking about social media in terms of labor, a 2015 article by Beverengen, Bohm, and Land note that prosumption on Twitter challenges Marxist perspectives on labor, because when people produce content, they're willingly participating, they're willingly participating in free productive labor, but have no expectations of a wage. So I want to follow up by asking, does this mean that the work is not exploitative? So that I mentioned earlier in 2015, things have changed now. These days, you can monetize a lot of posted pictures on video and videos on YouTube and Instagram if you pass a specific follower account. So people are being remunerated for this work. And it really begs the question, who gets paid for producing content? But with the rise of social media, this kind of concept of influencers also blurs the line between like everyday Alia and advertising professionals, right? And so once again, there are elements of exploitation at several junctures of producing and consuming social media content. So now that we've talked a little bit about the context, let's talk a little more about Muslim Twitter. So I found out about the London, Ontario attack on Twitter. That's the only place that I got any information and insights and data about the very brutal attack on this family of four. And an interesting hashtag that emerged shortly after was the Our London Family hashtag, which presents this guise of a Muslim community that's homogenous in terms of race, gender, and class. But something really troubling about some of the responses that came up was that folks were asking for a heightened police presence. And so what that did at the outset is that it alienated Black Muslims who've already had a very fraught relationship with London police in general. So already the idea of a united front starts to fall apart. In 2016, Black Muslim scholar and activist Delise Mugabo published a paper where she chronicled and analyzed her own alienation as a Black Muslim from the community that is imagined to be Middle Eastern, South Asian, and middle class when trying to organize against Islamophobia in Quebec. So the URL starts to mirror the IRL. And the idea of a united front falls apart both online and offline. There's like a mirroring that takes place online that kind of mimics what happens offline. A 2021 study by Mercier Dalfond and Hellier looks at Islamophobic violence across Canada, and it tells us that people who are most likely to be targeted in hate crimes are Muslims on the margins, but most particularly visibly Muslim women. And a 2020 study by Najib and Hopkins tells us that 85% of hate crimes against Muslims in the UK target Muslim women with some sort of head covering. It's significant then that one of the members of the Afzal family who was murdered, Madiha Afzal, wore a headscarf. Islamophobia, whether from the perspective of post-colonial studies, when we think about people like Edward Said, or from recent sociological analyses, proves itself to be inherently gendered. So following the incident, there was a universal condemnation of events, even though people had different ideas of what a path forward might look like. It's really interesting that a June 8th vigil in London, Ontario turned into what a lot of tweeters termed a press conference for elected officials, and even Justin Trudeau attended. And perhaps that this indicates that as a labor force, these condemnations, whether community-based or political, become part of placating the workforce and electorate. Contrastingly, following the outing of Osama Issa, which I totally accept, is something that circulated in much smaller circles, there were a few patterns I observed in the responses of Muslim men when you kind of compare them to the responses of Muslim women. So there was not a universal condemnation of the violence that several women in the community had faced. I found that many Muslim men mocked Osama's username online. It's party till Fajr, which is very corny. I know it means party till sunrise. It's stupid, whatever. And they argued that the problem was the lack of transparency around his education and background. So that third tweet actually that I've shared is by a Muslim woman who's kind of countering that narrative. But you know, it's important to note that this is not the first time that a Muslim public figure or expert has been outed as an abuser. And so we return to Miran Chandani's definition of emotional work. Yeah. For the most part, it was Muslim women who managed their self-feeling and named the violence that existed. It was Muslim women who expressed outrage and sadness. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a link to it, so you're gonna have to take my word for this. But there was a conversation that took place on Twitter Spaces, which is like this video conferencing thing where you can have little informal discussions, where women in the United Kingdom put together a forum discussing specifically the presence of Muslim incels in Western countries. And this was in direct response to the Osama Issa event. So ultimately, there's a twofold conversation that's taking place when I think about the work of engaging with gendered Islamophobia on the internet. On one hand, it's the exhausting work of disrupting dominant narratives, of educating, and of consuming an endless stream of disheartening stories about unthinkable violence. On the other hand, the work produces healing and community for survivors of violence, and women come together to demand accountability. So following this discourse, and the discourse specifically about Osama Issa, an American organization called Facing Abuse, that's their logo, gained a lot of traction. And they do work that is directly related to spiritual abuse in the Muslim community. And they provide tangible spaces, both online and offline, for survivors of violence for Muslim women to share their experiences, to be acknowledged, to access information and resources, and for survivors to literally expose abusers. So positive things come out of some of these discourses sometimes. Oh, sorry, it's not over yet. So in terms of the so what can we learn from this comparative case study? It's probably nothing too groundbreaking during a global pandemic when most of us spend a good amount of time interacting with people and institutions online, but it is that gendered expectations of work are mirrored in the virtual space. Muslim women are very much expected to placate their abusers, to educate the community at large, and to analyze the material on the internet for the benefit of everyone, even though it's draining work. And sometimes their work is co-opted, and sometimes their work is ridiculed. And then they have to process that. They have to do the emotional work of processing that. But I think that something else that's really notable is that the capacity for Muslim women to resist violence, to resist patriarchal power dynamics, also extends to the virtual sphere. Muslim women form communities, share resources, support each other. And the value of this work really transcends the bounds of capitalist categories of work and labor because it's rehabilitative. It encourages collectivism and it heals us as opposed to viewing us simply as workers or voters. Thank you. It's over now.